Welcome back to part 2. Today we're going to delve into the feedback for emission factors. So what are emission factors firstly? Well, how carbon accounting or the calculation of carbon emissions works is you basically take that input data, whether that's spend or activity, times an emission factor, this so-called sort of magic number, and that's how you calculate how many CO2e equivalent. So that emission factor is a conversion number really that quantifies what is the emissions produced per sort of unit of activity or input, such as liters of fuel or kilowatts of electricity or how much dollars you've spent on something. Similar to what we talked about in part 1, a lot of the sentiment from respondents was they wanted more guidance from the GHG protocol. This sentence on page 4 is quite interesting from the feedback. A lot of respondents said that the lack of supply-specific emissions data and payward lifecycle inventory emission factor databases is a major hurdle for market-wide adoption of Scope 3 accounting and reporting. To set the scene a little bit before we dive into the rest of the suggestions, Lindsay, can you give us some context on where emission factors come from and what types are available? What are payward versus non-payward? What do these all mean? And why is there a marketplace right now to have a payward version?
Awesome to be back talking about a topic that's really close to my heart. Emissions factors are definitely part of the core of carbon accounting. Essentially, like we talked about last time, there's 3 main methods to calculate emissions from purchased goods and services, and some of the other key categories under the GHG protocol. So these are the spend-based approach, activity-based, and supply-specific. What won't surprise you is essentially in order to calculate emissions, we're using an emissions factor for each of those methods. So there's going to be a pretty broad range of factors that are available, and these can be from a lot of different sources. Some governments will publish emissions factors, providing those to organizations within their jurisdictions as a way to kind of calculate emissions from those sources. Typically, that's led by kind of government or contracted academics that are pulling together that information. So that's certainly one area where emissions factors can come from, directly from governments. Secondly, academic journals are often a key source of emissions factors in the same way as governments are pulling together that information to allow you to estimate emissions based on science or detailed research. Academic journals can be a source of that as well. The third kind of area that we see is some organizations, they're doing kind of academic research, but essentially this is their business model. They're preparing a set of emissions factors based on that research and then publishing that for broader use within the industry. Oftentimes, essentially because it's their business model, they want to be compensated for the use of that. And so through licensing type of arrangement, they generally kind of license out the use of those emissions factors to third parties. So that's where this kind of paywall concept comes from. The sources that are essentially preparing those emissions factors for broad consumption without it costing you anything. And there's other emissions factor sources that are essentially requiring payment in order to access and use those particular emissions factors. So we can get into some of the challenges associated with paid emissions factors shortly. But yeah, it can be quite a few different sources, and emissions factors can really span quite a broad range of topics and areas under a specific GHG inventory.
So there's a lot of options in terms of where emission factors come from, which ones to pick. And oftentimes this is the struggle that we actually hear from our users or preparers of greenhouse gas inventory reports, is that they don't know what the right emission factor to pick. There's a lot of professional judgment calls to be made here. Obviously, like we talked about, the best one is to use that primary data, the one that's from your suppliers. But where it's not possible, you go back to these emission factor databases. Now onto suggestion 1. We can see there's a comment saying a lot of companies are relying on spend-based emission factors from these environmentally extended input-output EERO models, proxies, less reliable calculation methods due to the lack of supplier-specific data limitations. And one of the recommendations is to develop more constraints or limitations on the use of these ones. What do you think about that suggestion? What can we do right now where it might not be possible yet to get all of that supplier-specific emission factor data?
In the previous chat, we talked about the merits of limiting the spend-based approach in order to calculate emissions. So it's an interesting question in terms of limiting the use of environmentally extended input-outputs or other spend-based or low-quality kind of proxy data in the calculation of GHG emissions information. As we talked about before, essentially it comes back down to what the business is using this data for, their intended purpose, and their goals and objectives. Certainly in some instances, the use of spend-based proxy data could meet business objectives. And like we talked about, I think over time, the expectations of stakeholders will mean a greater reliance on primary data or other high quality sources of information rather than using default spend-based proxies as the kind of key calculation method. So with that in mind, I think it's in terms of forcing people to limit the use of these particular emissions factors and calculation approaches, I think that's probably a little bit misguided. Really, the focus should be on disclosing the use of that, looking at the uncertainty that that brings into the GHG inventory, and then making sure that stakeholders are aware of exactly the amount of spend-based information that's being incorporated into the inventory. If you've got visibility into that, stakeholders will make their own calls, whether this data is sufficient, and then companies, as an extension, will then look to where they can actually get better quality information. Certainly, placing an arbitrary limit on it seems to be not a requirement from my perspective.
And as businesses start on their carbon accounting journey, as more and more businesses and suppliers actually calculate their emissions, they're reaching to a point where they're able to figure out their emissions intensity per dollar of revenue. Most of the time, that's the first emission intensity or emission factor that they're able to calculate. Say how many CO2e per dollar of revenue, sales, or income. So this kind of falls into our second and third suggestion, allowing the use of these revenue-based supplier-specific emission factor. How do you see these fit into the overall picture?
This is like a natural extension. What we see is the kind of the best available information for the supplier-specific calculation is a detailed life cycle assessment associated with the goods and services that a business is purchasing. Often at the moment, the preparation of an LCA can be quite an exhaustive process and mean that it's difficult for businesses to afford to do that across their entire product or service suite, meaning that they're essentially kind of cherry picking that for some of their offerings. So in some ways, the revenue intensity based approach of collecting supplier specific information provides a middle ground between relying on proxy data and using something that's been provided by the company and broadly represents the emissions associated with the goods and services that the business is procured. Again, another key thing comes down to what are the assumptions, what's the uncertainty that's going into this calculation, and some of that is really driven by the nature of the business that you are procuring goods and services from. So if we take a concrete example, if I'm a metals processor and I'm buying from a mine, they only produce one type of mineral ore. Essentially, the emissions intensity of that particular input is going to be a lot closer tied to the specific purchase that I'm making, and there's going to be a lot less uncertainty or variability just by the nature of that purchase. If we contrast that with a large retailer that might have 10,000 different product SKUs that could be kind of composed of lots of different materials, obviously there's going to be a really broad range of emissions intensity associated with those products. And so using a revenue-based intensity metric is going to likely be a lot more uncertain in that context. So really, I think as a starting point, it's a good approach. To the extent that businesses can start to develop more detailed approaches to calculate their emissions, that's obviously going to be better. But again, it really comes down to disclosure and the professional judgment of the business that's receiving that information, whether it meets this threshold to be included within their own GHG inventory as a supplier-specific calculation.
That's a good reminder about the disclosure side of things. Like, this is a really good starting point, and it's providing that transparency on how this number has been calculated. The stakeholders can decide whether this is usable or not for their GHG inventory report. On to point 4 and 6, the respondents specified they wanted uniform emission factors for electricity, gas consumption by the grid, country, and region, also for air travel and for radiative forcing. What do these terms mean? What's the concern that these respondents are raising?
There's a couple of key things here. I think at the core of it is this idea of comparability. So essentially, if we're using emissions factors to calculate the emissions associated with a business's activity, likely we want those emissions factors to be consistent in their application across different businesses. At the moment, though, depending on where you source your emissions factor information from, these can vary quite a lot, even for the same kind of input that we're looking at. Take an example, the emissions associated with a litre or a gallon of diesel that's burned in a vehicle has a different emissions factor across different jurisdictions. This means that essentially, if you're relying on that and recording your emissions in the US versus Australia versus the UK, it could be quite a lot of difference in burning basically the same litre of diesel in that kind of context. So that inconsistency really drives some difficulties in terms of having comparable reporting. Hopefully over time, organizations that are responsible for the management and preparation of emissions factor information look across jurisdictions and try to align those where it's practical to do so. That means that everyone's reporting against the same kind of baseline and using the same data in order to get to an outcome. Hopefully this then increases comparability over time and helps users of this information to understand exactly what they're looking for. So that's at the very core level. When we get into some specific areas of GHG accounting and emissions factors, if we say take air travel, the fact that the GHG protocol doesn't specify exactly what's included in an emissions factor to be used in, say, air travel, it means that people are interpreting and applying emissions factors that are published by different organizations in different ways. In the context of air travel, there's several different components. Obviously, there's the fuel that's burned by the plane during the flight. There's emissions associated with getting that fuel to the plane itself. There's emissions associated with the airline operating the particular flight. If you think about things like waste or cabin crew or ground staff. And then in addition to that, there's this concept known as radiative forcing, another factor that increases the greenhouse gas impact of a plane's emissions. So all of these different components can potentially play into the emissions of an employee getting on a plane, but there's not a common agreement in terms of exactly which of those emissions factor components are included within the GHG reporting of an organization. So some choose to leave out this concept of radiative forcing, others don't do well to take. So they don't include the upstream portion of the fuel value chain. And so these differences mean that businesses are applying their emissions factors in different ways, which again really damages comparability and makes it difficult to do an apples to apples comparison on the same activities that are being done across different businesses. So hopefully by bringing those things together, it's going to mean that businesses are able to interpret the GHG accounting information in a way that's a bit more consistent with what you'd expect.
From the current state of things, there are so many options to pick from that really leads to differences across the GHG inventory reports and doesn't quite help with comparability and understanding that information. It'd be great if everyone just had the one emission factor that's appropriate and we could just choose that one for our one related activity and we're all in agreement on the same page. Well, that's exactly what point 9 actually is referring to. Develop and manage a comprehensive universal repository of emission factors that are free and updated regularly. Need to be publicly available for the consistent adoption of GHG accounting and reporting. This is really the ideal and this is really the heart of what we're trying to do at Someday. So what do you think this world or this universal transparent database would look like, Lindsay? And what kind of parameters do we need to have in place to ensure it's actually doing what we intend it to be and it is going to have data that we can trust?
I think in the broad context of Someday, what we generally try and do is focus on that transparency piece. For that reason, the majority of the emissions factors within the Someday database are from publicly available sources. You see, publicly available sources mean that essentially there's a lot more understanding exactly how they've been prepared and can be used more broadly by organizations of all different types. So the use of paywall or private data kind of damages that transparency because even if you're paying for it and licensing it, there's a limit to the amount that you can actually share that information with people. And so they can't go into the details of how you prepared your inventory and some of the basis of preparation, which is really important to make sure that this stuff is auditable as well. So certainly in our view, this would be a great step forward if we could get to a point where essentially emissions factors are open source. Organizations can use the emissions factors, understand them, and they're not behind a paywall. So that's a world that we would really like to see come true. At the moment, there's obviously practical reasons why some providers are essentially kind of paywalling their emissions factors. And this is like linked to their business model, right? They're putting in a lot of time and resources in order to quantify and calculate these emissions factors. And they need a way to essentially recoup those costs and hopefully make a profit. So it's understandable that this is where it's going. And so hence why I think that one of the key things that we expect to see is governments stepping up and playing a bigger role in terms of providing resources and expertise to support the development of comprehensive and open source emissions factors that essentially become a public good for companies. So companies can rely on us because they're trusted, free, and widely available. They can be understood easily by stakeholders and can be comparable across organizations. So I think different governments need to look at how they can work together to pool resources in order to develop these emissions factor databases. What we see is even a lot of the publicly available emissions factor database information is relatively outdated. Where the state of the industry is at the moment, generally somebody uses the best publicly available information in terms of emission factors. Even us, some of the emissions factors that we're using for certain jurisdictions are from 2018, 2019, 2020. We obviously do follow best practice and adjust them to CPI, but the reality is in some jurisdictions, more up-to-date information isn't publicly available, which can obviously create some challenges for using those and for users who want to have up-to-date information. As organizations reduce their emissions, the modeling associated with the emissions factors need to then reflect that. So if there's a big lag in terms of the preparation of proxy emissions factor information, it's not going to reflect the good work that the world is hopefully doing in the future, and mean that that outdated information then hurts the accuracy of future reporting. So we really need to come up with a model that allows us to have access to timely emissions factor information without it costing each individual business a whole bunch of money. So I think that's going to be an important step forward in terms of how we can actually either crowdsource that information or how we can look at different models to mean that that becomes something that's just a public good and available for all businesses that are looking to understand and quantify their emissions. The reality of it is, if you're unable to get timely and relevant emissions factor information, it's obviously going to impact the data quality associated with everyone's GHG inventory. And it also means that you're not going to be able to recognize the direction of travel in terms of emissions factors reducing over time as the grid decarbonizes and supply chains start to decarbonize. So being able to recognize that through the use of timely emissions factor information then becomes really key. And so we can start to see some of that progress even outside of your specific kind of direct value chain related emissions.
From all of this feedback, we can kind of see the need and ask for two main groups of emission factors. So there's that primary data, that supply-specific emission factor based on the products or services that that business or supplier provides. And then we're wanting to create this universal, transparent databases where it takes involvement of the government and broader society to contribute and figure out these emission factors. This will take a lot of resources. Is it worth it? And should we be doing it when we're heading towards that North Star of primary data?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important discussion to have in terms of we have finite resources, both for the quantification and measurement of emissions, but then the broader kind of action associated with this as well. I certainly see publicly available, accurate, general proxy emissions factor database as one of the kind of key things that we're going to need for carbon accounting going forward. If you think about it, a lot of the time we don't have supply-specific information in the intro, which means that we need to rely on some proxy. So by having a really low-quality proxy data set, that's going to further impact the data quality associated with GHG inventories. Even if you are quantifying your emissions at the moment, largely those are going to be linked to proxies. So it's not like having this broad-based emissions factor database is really going to be the tide that lifts all boats. And in terms of the data quality side of things, from there, individual companies can focus on improving their specific data quality hotspots and then getting to a point where they can provide primary emissions factor database. And then we get into this virtuous circle where not only do we have high quality primary emissions data, but then also the base level proxy information is really great quality as well. That's not going to happen until we invest the resources into supporting that in a way that's transparent and, really importantly, available to everyone that wants to use it. So I see both of those things as really critical to get to a point where emission factor information actually means something and starts to drive action within businesses. So I think they're both really key pillars, and certainly the government has a role to play either in supporting that process of preparing that high quality emissions factor database, or working with partners within the industry that are doing that on their behalf or in collaboration. So that's really where I see things going. There's something either or, but it really needs to be both of those things happening. One of them can be really led by industry and individual companies looking to do their emissions accounting properly, and the other one is a broader based support from actors within government and other broader society stakeholders.
Like you said, it is a virtuous cycle, and as everyone improves on their data quality, the tide will lift all boats. Everyone's quality will improve, and we'll get to a state where we understand our greenhouse gas emissions a lot better. Other important reminders that we, right now, with where we're at, it's just to be transparent with your disclosures so that we all understand what these numbers mean. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Lindsay. I think that was really, really interesting. For our next one, part 3, we're going to be talking about emissions boundaries, so stay tuned for that. See you guys next time.
See you there.